right. This is Life Matters with Nate and Jen. This is episode number 14, and we are in our series on parenting. Our first series was on marriage, and we have 8 episodes up on my YouTube channel, Fired for Truth. It's in a playlist if you want to check those out. And this is the 6th video in our parenting series, but the 14th video that we've done overall, which is amazing that we've done that many. But we have a fun one, hopefully fun and interesting in this video. This is going to cover something that some of you may have some understanding in. Jennifer's more the expert on this than I am, but I'll fill in where, I think there's some relevance to my understanding. But this is going to deal with birth order and how it pertains to personalities. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to this. And, Jennifer and I are both the oldest of 4. So we understand the oldest dynamic pretty well, but we have 4 children. And we'll be sharing, some interesting thoughts regarding our experience with our own kids in birth order. But birth order can help us to understand our kids' personalities, and it can aid us in raising them, how we should train them up, and also dealing with the issues that they may face in life. And it's a significant, factor for most kids and their personality is their birth order, their position in the family unit. And it can affect, your position as a sibling in the birth order can affect your relationship with parents. It can affect certainly your relationship with siblings or even your peers, depending on what birth order your peers are in. And it's typically set around ages 5 to 7. So that's usually when the birth order is kind of concrete and settled in. So that just gives us a quick little introduction of what we're talking about in this video. And Jennifer is going to share some very important factors regarding different positions in the family.
Well, I really enjoy this topic. I just think it's really interesting. One of the resources that some of this information comes from is the Birth Order book by Dr. Kevin Leman. He's got some other books and is kind of an expert on family dynamics and how our birth order can affect our personality. And like Nate said, our personalities are set from about ages 5 to 7. So depending on how where we were born in the lineup and what siblings come before and after us, it affects how we view life. But birth order is not a cookie cutter. It's just one variable, and some of the things that we'll talk about on this video, you might say, well, that's not true for my family, or that's not true for me and my kids. And that's totally fine. These are just clues that can kind of give you a hint about how some things might be affected by a kid's birth order and their position in the sibling lineup. I think it's interesting. There's research to show that certain birth orders tend to go into certain career fields. Sometimes leadership abilities or being able to negotiate with other people fit in. And so we'll share a little bit about some of those traits and how they kind of line up with certain birth orders.
Nice.
Typically.
So we're going to talk about firstborn, which is what we are. We're both the oldest of 4. So we have experience in that.
That's true. So some typical markers of firstborns. Dr. Lehman says that there's 2 kinds of firstborns. There's a compliant caregiver type personality, and there's also sometimes firstborns that are more aggressive. They're kind of the movers and shakers. All firstborns are their parents' guinea pigs. Sometimes I think about that with our firstborn, and I'm like, we were just trying to figure out how to be the best parents that we could be and trying things out on our oldest. And sometimes parents typically overdo it a little bit with their first child.
A little overprotective, maybe?
Maybe a little overprotective.
Although back in our generation, our parents let us play out in the street and go around the neighborhood and play, stay out after dark and all that. And this day and age, most
Things
parents
don't
allow that. So
yeah. Right. So typically with a firstborn, every move is photographed or videotaped, and so these kiddos often go on to be leaders and achievers, But sometimes that's due to their parents kind of encouraging
Yeah.
and expectations. Sometimes we put a lot on the shoulders of firstborns, and they have a lot to live up with,
True.
live up to. Some of the strengths of a firstborn personality, they can be take charge. They're usually fairly cooperative. They're pretty thorough in getting work done. They're organized. They usually are good goal setters. They know what they want to achieve. And they tend to be scholarly. So those are, again, typical traits, not always, but generally found with a firstborn.
Yeah.
So some of the weaknesses that might come from a firstborn personality. Sometimes they can be a little overbearing, maybe aggressive. Sometimes they can be too compliant, kind of a people pleaser, because they're really used to having their parents, kind of watching and at their expectations maybe. A little perfectionistic,
Yeah.
maybe critical of themselves or others. And they might put themselves or others under too much pressure. So those are just, again, some possible firstborn traits. But one parenting tip that is shared in the book that I thought was good is when you're raising a firstborn kid who may tend to be a perfectionist, to flaunt your own imperfections as a parent. Show your kids that it's okay to be imperfect and to make mistakes, and that they can recover for it. Yeah. Sometimes kids are more hard on themselves than we are as their parents. So that's just one tip that Dr. Lehman shares to help kiddos that are firstborns go a little easier on themselves.
Yeah, and now we'll talk about the dreaded middle child.
The dreaded
Just
middle
kidding.
child.
Well, sometimes
they
it's
do
known
get
as
a bad rap.
Yeah,
they?
it's sometimes known as middle child syndrome.
Yeah.
So we're gonna talk about that here as we follow up from the firstborn. Now we're talking about middle children.
Yep. So poor middle children, they can tend to feel overlooked. They aren't the first one on the scene. They're not the baby of the family. They're somewhere in the middle. Our family has 2 middle children. So we have 4 children. So the 2 in the middle are the middle children. So some typical markers about middle children. So sometimes they're kind of mysterious. They tend to be a little more secretive or a little less likely to share everything as openly as their siblings. Sometimes a middle child will play off of the sibling above them. Like if the firstborn is very scholarly, maybe the secondborn, the middle child, might go in a different direction to kind of pave his own path. He doesn't necessarily want to be a cookie cutter of his older brother or sister. So maybe they'll be athletic, maybe they'll be musical or creative and kind of have a different focus.
Yeah.
Middle children often really like to hang out with their peers. Their friend group is very important to them. Again, maybe that has something to do with family, is a little more doting on, they feel maybe, on their older sibling or the baby of the family. But their friend group typically is very important to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. So some strengths of the middle children.
Yeah. So due to that middle child status, most middle children are pretty excellent mediators. They're pretty good at negotiating and cooperating and getting along. They're used to sharing, right? They've had to share mom and dad. They've never had mom and dad to themselves. They are usually a little more willing to take risks. They are usually pretty diplomatic. And they can be trusted with sensitive information. They're pretty good secret keepers.
They usually don't have as many photos in their baby book as the firstborn.
Yes, that is that it can be.
And that sometimes can
true.
be a complaint of the middle child.
Yes.
Wow, why'd you have so many pictures of my older sibling? You
Yep.
know. All right. Weaknesses.
Yeah. So some weaknesses that can be found with middle children. They can be rebellious if they feel like maybe they don't fit in or they're not getting kind of the attention that they want. They might be stubborn. They can be uncooperative. Sometimes, due to their good negotiating skills and their want to kind of keep peace and harmony, they may hate confrontation. And those friends that are so important to them that can be kind of a detriment if they feel that their relationship with their friend is too important. It might cloud their judgment to stand up for what's right.
Yeah.
So those are some things that could happen with a middle
Or
child.
if their friend is not really a good person of character, you
Mm-hmm.
know, if they're kind of, I don't know, I guess not so much a troubled kid, but if they just, you know, have some issues, obviously that's not good
Right.
because then they could potentially get kind of drug over to that.
Mm-hmm.
So just something to be aware of, particularly.
Right. So Dr. Lehman says, as a parenting tip for middle kids, to really help that middle child feel special. Maybe for that child, there's something really specific that you do with that child that
Yeah.
they don't have to share you with their older or younger siblings. And really, pour into them and make them feel built up and important to you.
Yeah, I remember, you know, a few times talking to one or both of the middle children at different times and saying, hey, you know, why don't we go out to lunch together today or something, you know? Let's even just something as simple as running some errands, you know, as long as the errands aren't super, super boring, you know,
Yeah.
something in it for them. Hey, you know, why don't we, even if you do have boring errands, you could say, hey, you know, would you help me at the grocery store? And then afterwards, let's go down to the coffee shop, you know, and grab a coffee, or let's go grab a sundae or some fries or something. And I noticed that just really helped the kid, you know, the child perk up.
Yeah.
Because they felt special. They're like, oh, okay, so it's just you and me? Awesome, you know?
Yeah, having that undivided feel, time with parents.
Paid attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good.
All right, so middle child. Okay, we made it through the middle child. All right. How about the youngest?
The youngest child. So, things that we hear about the baby of the family, typical markers. They love the limelight, which we thought was kind of funny because our daughter, who's the youngest, is in theater and they're called the Limelighters. So,
yeah, wow.
So she likes the limelight for sure. Typically, they tend to be a little on the outgoing side, often very affectionate, and the book calls them personable manipulators. So nice. They're going to, just smile at their parents and have them wrapped around their little finger.
Like like my daughter, you know, when she wants something, she'll be like, Daddy, yes. Do you have a minute?
Yeah, this guy, Hannah definitely has him wrapped around her finger. Strengths of being the baby of the family. Usually, they're very likable. They are people oriented. They relate well to others. They can be very tenacious. They will stick after something and go for it when they want it. They are caring, entertaining, and genuine. So
all right.
Those are some positive traits from the baby of the family.
And some weaknesses for the youngest child, typically.
Yeah. So the youngest child lives in the shadow of their older siblings. So they, can feel like they have a lot to live up to or kind of trouble kind of striking out on their own and making their own personality.
Yeah.
They may seem undisciplined or unfocused. They can tend to be a little bit on the gullible side, so you might be easily misled. And they also may appear to be self-centered or a little spoiled.
And definitely accused of such by their older
That's
siblings.
That's right, yes. Those older siblings.
They're the baby. They get everything they want, you know. And I think that's another reason why the middle children can also, they can feel frustrated because, the older child, the first kid, he's the one that has, 500 pictures in his baby book and I've only got 27, and then when the baby comes along, it's like, oh, sometimes they, they feel like neglected on both ends.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so important to have some special time with your middle kids as well.
Yep. Let's see. So Dr. Lehman in his book shares a parenting tip for youngest kids. He says to make sure that they do have their share of responsibilities. A lot of times, by the time that youngest kiddo comes along, parents have kind of relaxed in their expectations or some of the things I think that we used to really get focused on. Now it's not a hill we want to die on anymore. And so raising younger children is different from when we were first raising our oldest child at each stage.
Sure.
So He says, do make sure that they have their share of responsibilities. That's going to help them in the future, build their character, and to also celebrate their events, because when you're the youngest of, 2 or 3 or 4 or more, watching your siblings do all the things that you're now doing, it might feel like, oh, that's old hat now. But they need to know that their milestones are just as important, and we celebrate, and we're excited for them as they reach those as they grow.
Absolutely. So that's the wrap up on the youngest children. And just remember, these are typical situations, generalizations that are not always going to be across the board in every situation.
Yeah.
So if you're sitting there saying, hey, that's not my kid, don't take offense. Maybe there's a little different dynamic in your situation.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some of those things that kind of make the birth order variables untrue. So
yeah, and if you have something very different, feel free to reach out to us and share your experience with us. We would love to understand, your experience with your kids and how the birth order and personality thing, how that dynamic played out in your household.
Sure.
So let's talk about only children.
Yes, so only children. Sometimes only children are only children because their parents weren't able to have more children. And those parents, all their energy and attention just went to this one child. And that's not a bad thing. That does set them up to a special set of circumstances where they could be a little sheltered or maybe a little bit spoiled. Some parents also choose to only have one child. And that child, for whatever reason, financial, expenses of having more than one child, or parents' careers, or whatever. And that child might also be treated as a little bit of an adult, with only having their parents as their other people in the house. So that child could be pressured or acclimated to act a little bit more mature, responsible, and dependable than other children his or her age. But whether the child is an only child by choice or by circumstance, only children are often ultra perfectionists. They want things just so, and they may tend to get very frustrated if things don't go their way. Only children do have a lot of traits like firstborn, and a little bit also like the youngest of the family. So some of the strengths of an only child, often they are confident, perfectionistic, organized, scholarly, logical, ambitious, and good problem solvers. So those are some of the typical positive traits of an only child.
And there's some weaknesses, of course, as well.
Sure. So sometimes only children can tend to be self-centered, critical of themselves or others, inflexible because they're kind of used to having their own way, and they may put themselves or others under too much pressure and tend to believe that they are always right.
Yeah. Wow. So only children.
Yep.
Okay, so, there's some exceptions though.
Yeah. Well, and with the only children, Dr. Lehman also shared the same parenting tip that he shared with firstborns, which is to let them see you mess up sometimes and kind of show them that it's okay to make mistakes and be imperfect. And we all will make mistakes, and not to be so hard on themselves.
Yeah.
So.
Exactly.
So there's some exceptions to the birth order rules, if you want to call it that. Again, these are just variables. We've said, not every kid follows this type of personality, even if they were born at a certain birth order. But there are exceptions that have been found that throw kind of things off of the typical firstborn, middle child, only child, and youngest child. When there is a gap of 5 years or more between siblings, the next child born will have some firstborn traits. So if you've got, a 10-year-old and a 8-year-old, and then maybe the next baby is born when the second one's 8 years old, that child may be the youngest in the family, but they will have traits similar to a firstborn child because they're kind of a second firstborn. There's also exceptions to the birth order rules when there's a gap of 5 years, when there's physical, mental, or emotional differences. So, a sibling with a disability sometimes um, may not have the same um, kind of chronological, they may be chronologically the right age, but they're not necessarily going to have the same birth order personality.
Yeah.
Other variables and exceptions to their birth order rules, if a sibling dies, then that changes the dynamic, of course. If a sibling is adopted into a family, that would change the dynamic as well. Um, Blended families,
Yeah.
like the Brady Bunch, right? So that will definitely change the dynamic, and we're going to talk about that in
I
just a
definitely
minute.
have some experience on the blended family situation.
And then the birth order of the parents themselves can affect how the, I guess, the birth order dynamic of their children plays out. So as parents, it's also important to know that your own birth order can influence how you parent your children. So there is a tendency for a parent to over identify with the child that is the same birth order that they are.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
So this can lead to either putting too much pressure on that child or spoiling or favoring that child. So it's really important for us to be aware of this tendency so that we can make sure we don't over identify and we're not being unfair in how we treat that child positively or negatively. Nate and I are both the oldest. We were the oldest of our siblings, and so
we're both achievers. We both have been in positions and careers where there's either supervisory roles or leadership, some type of leadership role, some type of public, role. And so, we grew up as the first. And so our parents were probably the more overprotective of us, at least when we were younger.
Maybe, yeah.
And then maybe once they started having other kids, of course, then they loosened up a little bit with us. And Jennifer and myself, we often were tasked with helping to give care to the younger siblings, or
help out, yeah.
to help out with more of the domestic stuff, than typically the younger kids were, perhaps.
Yeah. So just things to consider when you're thinking about this or learning about it. If you find it interesting, there's a lot more out there. The whole book that Dr. Lehman has, but there's lots of other resources online or in the libraries about it. I just find it interesting, and a lot of factors of my growing up and now parenting kids, I think it falls into line with some of the typical traits that you see.
Yeah. Definitely.
We wanted to touch on blended families. A lot of families in America, or around the world, I guess, but may be blended families, and that can complicate the birth order situation and personalities and just getting along in general. But in regards to birth order, you could have a child who was the firstborn in their original household, and then now with a blended family, they're living with another oldest child. And so just consider how that might be if they're kind of used to being the top of the pecking order. And that personality is kind of put into place by age 5 to 7 years old. So if the blended family is happening after that, they're not going to stop having those firstborn traits just because they're now living with someone who's older than them.
Yeah, and my situation is a good example of that, because I was, my parents divorced when I was 4, and my mom remarried around the time I was about 7. And so I had, was pretty close to having that birth order as the firstborn solidified, and enjoyed that position for a few years. And then now I have 3 siblings, step siblings, who were all older than I was. And so that caused a little bit of a train wreck. Although because the oldest one was several years older than me, he was like 16, I was like 7. So there was obviously not going to be me challenging, his position. But there was a lot of, turmoil and jockeying for position, and it seemed like a lot of the kids got kind of lumped into the middle child, almost complaining about the other siblings. And then my stepfather had passed away suddenly from a heart attack. when I was about 8, and that made for a very challenging dynamic because now
Mm-hmm.
my mother is the head of the household, and she's only been, the stepmother to those children for a year or so,
Yeah.
and now their father's passed, and there's still, myself and my sister, and my mom had my second sister, my half sister, 2 weeks about after he had passed away.
Mm-hmm.
So it was quite a traumatic situation. And, maybe sometime we'll do a video on trauma and how that can affect us. But
Mm-hmm.
certainly that affected our already strained, blended family
Yeah.
dynamic. That was an unusual circumstance. But then a few years later, when I was around 10, my mother remarried again, and this person also had several kids. And so, I'd had a couple of
Mm-hmm.
years where I didn't have, I had actually moved in with my dad for a few years, and so I kind of became the only child for about 2 years. And then I moved back into, once again, being almost the low man on the totem pole. So I survived. Look how I
Good.
turned out through a lot of prayer and by the grace of the Father.
Yeah.
But blended families definitely have some additional dynamics and
Mm-hmm.
something to be thinking of. And as we've been going through these different uh, you know areas of, I guess, ages and birth order, you might be saying, well, my family had some complications, things were different.
Yeah.
It very well could be, but
Definitely.
hopefully hopefully you'll have a chance to share your experience with somebody maybe who's kind of coming along, behind you, and maybe if you are older, have more wisdom, more experience, you can kind of take on a mentoring position if possible to
Mm-hmm.
help that person through some of the difficulties of all life situations, but certainly blended families have their own set of challenges that come along.
Yeah. So we just wanted to share these, kind of typical traits of these different birth orders. We hope that this has been interesting to you. Maybe it will help kind of help you figure out your kids' personalities a
Mm.
little bit more, their needs and wants, how they might be feeling about where they're at in the
Yeah.
sibling order, and maybe meet their needs a little bit more for whatever it is that they're needing from you as a parent.
Yeah. So this has been Life Matters with Nate and Jen, episode number 14 on birth order and personality. And so we hope that this has been encouraging to you. Feel free, as always, to share your feedback with us,
Mm-hmm.
ask questions. You can reach out to us at nate@firedfortruth.org. And we have at least a couple more parenting videos in the repertoire here before we finish up this series.
Yep.
But we'll add these to the playlist. There is a parenting playlist on my YouTube channel, Fired for Truth, as well. And but if you have any questions, reach out to us or hit me up on Facebook. But until next time, we thank you so much for watching. Take care and God bless.